Hello and welcome to the Enterprise Talk Conversation Series, a peer knowledge resource by the CXOs for the CXOs. Now to our host, Kanika Goswami.
Hi, we welcome you to a podcast on stage with enterprise thought leaders. My name is Kanika Goswami and I'm the managing editor of On Media's 6 B2B enterprise technology publications. We have engaging conversations with global thought leaders and industry experts on a regular basis, and these conversations reach over 1.3 million business leaders worldwide. While we usually talk with thought leaders in this podcast, today we have something more exciting to present. We have with us Mr. Robin Wilton. He's a director of Internet Trust, and Callum Voge. He's a director of Government Affairs and Advocacy at the Internet Society in UK. I welcome both of you to this conversation today, Callum and Robin. I hope we have an insightful conversation. We shall be speaking about Internet Safety and Encryption, highlights of the Global Encryption Day, which has just passed a couple of days ago. A little bit about our guests, and then I'll hand over the stage to them. Callum joined the Internet Society in July 2021, and he serves as the Director of Governmental Affairs and Advocacy. In his role, he tracks and analyzes incoming legislations to understand how it may positively or negatively impact the Internet, and they use this information to advocate for change. Before joining the Internet Society, Callum worked as a senior policy advisor in the UK Civil Service, where he was leading a team on Internet safety negotiations under the UK's G7 presidency. He also spent 5 years working for the non-profit media organization Project Syndicate. Robin is the Internet Society's Director for Internet Trust, helping to advocate for an Internet that fulfills people's expectations over privacy, security, and trustworthiness. Having spent 35 years in the IT industry, Robin has a solid technical background with experience in systems engineering, consultancy, program management, and policy-level advocacy. Welcome you to our discussion, both Robin and Callum. We'd like to first know a little bit about the Internet Society. What are its goals and how it makes a difference? Would you like to explain a little bit for the benefit of our audiences?
Sure. Callum, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take that one. So yeah, thanks a lot for having us here, Kanika. It's great to speak with you and your audience. To introduce a little bit, the Internet Society, it's a global nonprofit organization that focuses on building, promoting, and defending the Internet. A slogan we have is that the Internet is for everyone, or should be for everyone. And I think something that makes the Internet Society quite unique is that we're supported by a global community. So we have over 110 chapters in different countries around the world. And we have at this point, over 100,000 individual members that support our mission and volunteer their time to work with us in advocacy. So that's a little bit about the Internet Society. And, today our topic, it's encryption, which is one of the topics that the Internet Society is very passionate about. And we've been working on this topic for many years now. And we're one of the founding members of something called the Global Encryption Coalition, which is a group of over 350 organizations around the world in 104 different countries. And this coalition, our mission is to protect encryption in countries and multilateral fora where encryption is under threat, but also to support efforts by companies to offer strong encryption to their users. So that's a little bit about the Internet Society and the work that we've been doing on encryption.
Robin, would you want to add anything to that? Or Callum has done the entire job?
I think he's done a very good job, especially seeing as he's only been at the Internet Society for about a fifth as long as I have. But I think
That's
also
interesting.
one way to really boil this down, I think, is that the Internet Society is interested in making sure that the Internet fulfills a couple of basic things. One is access, because if people can't get access to the Internet, they can't benefit from it. And the second is trust, because if you can get online, but you can't trust the way that you get online or the services and information you find once you get online, then again, the potential benefits of the Internet are undermined. And so those two themes of access and trust drive most of what we do.
Correct. Now, one of the questions we had in mind to ask you was, IoT devices are significantly used by cyber criminals as vectors to successfully accomplish successful DDoS, denial of services attacks. What strategies can businesses implement to minimize the risk of this kind of brute forces so that, as you just mentioned, the Internet becomes a safer place for people to operate in?
Yes, this is a really interesting one, and we did substantial work on IoT and IoT security, and that was part of what led to our major project on encryption. So I think a starting point for IoT is, yes, I know your audience is predominantly from the commercial sector, but I think we need to start by acknowledging that they're only one of the stakeholders here. So if a pretty good short list of stakeholders would include IoT device manufacturers, IoT service providers, the application developers who write the applications that IoT connected devices use, and of course there are also the retailers, because an awful lot of IoT is aimed at the retail market, and then the consumer is also a stakeholder. So these are all around the business stakeholders that you're engaging with. Specifically, the threat that you mentioned of the use of connected devices and connected objects as recruited helpers in a denial of service attack. Yes, that is a threat to businesses, because a DDoS attack like that can knock a business offline. In fact, in one instance, it basically knocked a country offline, which was a bit embarrassing. So if you look at it that way, first, there's an enterprise security and resilience aspect to this, and that predominantly should be a defensive task for the enterprise. But clearly, if you scale it up to the country level, where you're actually getting a country knocked offline by a denial of service attack on its internet infrastructure, that then becomes a cybersecurity issue as well. So it's a very large domain. The good news is that in several countries and regions, including the US and the EU and the UK and elsewhere, a substantial amount of work's been done, particularly over the last 4 to 5 years, to really break down what IoT security depends on, and to come up with both codes of conduct and potentially also certification schemes for IoT devices and for their deployment that help to close some of those gaps that otherwise potentially leave the way open to denial of service attacks. The simplest one, perhaps, design your IoT devices so that when a user plugs one in, they have to change the default password. Don't leave the default password there, because if that becomes known, then a whole family of devices might be compromised. That's just a really simple example. But I think also, just really quickly, one thing that we should always bear in mind is, and this applies to IoT security, but it also applies to encryption. We used to think of encryption as securing data, and actually that's no longer safe as a starting assumption. Encryption secures your life, actually. And think of this in the context of a connected object. A connected object could be the CCTV camera and the door lock on your house. It could be your vehicle. So IoT actually, and Bruce Schneier makes this point very effectively, IoT means that the digital world has physical effect, and that physical effect can actually kill you. So this isn't just about data encryption anymore. This is about confidentiality, but also about physical safety.
Right. Callum, would you want to add something to it?
Robin is our expert on this. He wrote a really great a paper that I think people can find online. But I would say, and maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of our conversation already, but when we see governments who are trying to, for example, create encryption backdoors for access, there is that fear that they might not envision those backdoors being used in this sector, right? IoT devices. But it's very hard to make sure that backdoors don't travel and are used in unexpected kind of scenarios. So this is something I know that Robin and I have discussed in the past is, for that encryption to be effective with IoT, there are backdoors that creates new vulnerabilities, even if it wasn't planned for those backdoors to be in those devices in the first place. I guess, again, getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but just the only point I would maybe add to Robin's great summary there.
I think it's legitimate to make that link, because when you change the password on an IoT device, what you're changing is authentication. You're strengthening the authentication to that device. And authentication is one of the things that relies on encryption underneath. So we think of how you authenticate. The vast majority of us authenticate the vast majority of the time using a user ID and a password. Well, if that password is not hashed or encrypted somewhere, it's vulnerable. So encryption actually underpins all of these things. Authentication, authorization, and indeed access control. And if enterprises don't have robust authorization and access control, then they are open to precisely the kind of denial of service attack that you mentioned. Because those attacks are attacks on the enterprise infrastructure. They are attacks on the authorization and access control mechanisms.
And more importantly, there are attacks on enterprise data, which could, all kinds of risks involved there, including penalties and
Ultimately,
compliance
that's
risks.
right.
Yeah. Do you think multi-factor authentication helps?
I do. I am so wedded to multi-factor authentication that here are some of the multi-factor authentication tokens that I use. I'm never far from one. Multi-factor authentication is extremely important. I think I have it enabled on pretty much all of my devices, whether it's, as I just showed you, in the form of a token, or whether it's on my iPad, for example. I use a virtual one-time password generator. And increasingly, I'm happy to say that actually when I contact enterprises online, their multi-factor authentication is often something like an out-of-band callback, a message to my phone, an authentication code, and so on. Yesterday evening I had that when I ordered a pizza. They sent me a code back to my phone to make sure it was me, and I'm happy with that because that's a payment. I know some people find two-factor authentication inconvenient. But to be honest, I would sooner have the inconvenience of two-factor authentication than the inconvenience of a compromised credit card. That's right, yes.
No, that is true. There has to be there is no balance there. There's really no choice there. You cannot, there is no way you can, give up on security to, cater to your convenience or happiness or whatever.
It's almost always a trade-off. But with good design, what you might be able to do is have a thing that you trust, which actually does the inconvenient bit for you. So some of your audience might want to look at, for example, the so-called FIDO Alliance, FIDO. They do that. They create a trustworthy thing which does the inconvenient bit for you. So if you think of this, you authenticate yourself to the trustworthy thing, and it then does the multi-factor stuff on your behalf. So this idea of having a trusted agent that does things that you would do if you could be bothered, but you find them inconvenient, I think it's quite a good design principle.
Yeah, but then there is always that, I hate to be sounding like a cynic here, but there is always that opportunity of an attack on that trusted thing, because it's also going to be online at the end of the day. And anything that is online cannot escape those brilliant cyber hacking and whatever have you security risks brains out there.
Yeah,
so
I remember
it's a trade-off at the end of the day.
The great American investor and billionaire Warren Buffett at one point in one of his speeches said, people always say you shouldn't put all your eggs in one basket. I don't think that's always a really bad thing, but you have to take really good care of the basket.
That is true. It's known for very common sense.
Yes, yeah. I would say, with this multi-factor authentication, yes, it is an additional friction, as we said, but it's effective. And I think that's why we see it being rolled out by so many companies now. I think even the last year, probably the pandemic really pushed this need for security. But yeah, it is effective, and companies are using it for that reason exactly. So I think the friction, even if you aren't using a kind of centralized device or option like Robin mentioned, I think people are willing to take this friction because they understand the importance.
Right.
And I think in the security context, yes, I think people are more or less prepared to have that little bit of extra friction. I think where people still haven't quite adjusted to that is in the privacy domain. And here again, I think there is huge scope for technology to be put to our service by creating take the same principle but apply it to privacy instead of authentication. So, for instance, if your online privacy at the moment depends on you setting 5 different buttons, that's a real pain. But imagine if you had a trusted agent that was setting those buttons for you, then it would remove the friction. Now, I think we have yet to find someone who will develop that trusted agent. But think about it this way. I mean, when I started in the IT industry, a $6 million mainframe could process a few million instructions a second. We're now walking around with phones that do 1,000 times that, 6 gigahertz processors. Some of that processing power must be put to our service. And I think a really good way of doing that would be trusted privacy agents that run on your phone that are as bulletproof as possible, but that you can trust to do the inconvenient bits for you. And if you think about the application of AI, they could actually learn over time what our personal privacy posture is, and start to either just check with us, this looks like the kind of website where you would normally insist on 2-factor authentication. Do you want me to do that for you? I would love to see that happen.
It's an angel investor idea, Robin. Completely
Absolutely.
out there.
And as far as I'm concerned, and they would be an angel in my books.
They would take it up. Somebody would take it up. It's just a matter of time. Look at the amount of billions of dollars that companies sink in their cybersecurity solutions, policies to stay resilient, all of that. And if it doesn't happen, look at the bigger amounts they have to pay as fines and penalties if there is an attack. So I'm sure that the time is right for somebody to think of something trustable like this and then run it or use it. Let's hope it happens soon in our lifetimes.
I'm going to go and check Kickstarter to see if it.
Right. Now we'll talk about encryption laws. I'm sure, as a global organization, you would be aware of the strengths and the drawbacks of how various governments across the world are taking encryption. How seriously are they taking it? So how strong do you think are the encryption laws globally? And do you see a need for change in these policies? What kind of efforts to be strengthened to ensure a safe environment for everyone on the internet, which is a goal of the Internet Society, I think so. So do you think what we have right now is adequate? If it is not, what do you think needs to be done more? And for all the countries, it's not UK or US specific. It's across the world. Digital literacy and access is growing in leaps and bounds. So everybody should have a safe and secure access. Are we there? What more do we need to do? No,
we're not there. We're not there, unfortunately.
Nowhere close.
So again, I think maybe the pandemic has helped raise awareness about this as more and more activities have gone online. So I know in the recent year or two, we've seen a lot of new cybersecurity directives being introduced by different governments. And sometimes those are opportunities to talk about encryption and security and kind of expectations with sensitive data. There may be other opportunities, kind of proactive ways to improve encryption safeguards. One would be right now in the EU, they're talking about the Media Freedom Act, right? Rules to protect journalists and media outlets. And there's been discussion about adding, safeguards for the access to encryption there and how journalists need access to encryption. So there are some of these, I would say, small opportunities that are being discussed where encryption is being framed in a very positive way. Governments are recognizing that and they're trying to put that forward. Unfortunately, I would say maybe those are the exceptions to the rule, because unfortunately what we have seen is in fact the exact opposite. So governments introducing new legislation to limit the use of encryption, actually. And so examples of this would be Australia, where you're based, also Kanika, in India, Canada, USA, Sri Lanka. The list kind of goes on. I think maybe 2 countries that we could zoom in a little bit in this conversation, which Robin and I have been paying a lot of attention to. It's the UK. They have the online safety bill that was recently passed. It received royal assent just last week. And then also in the EU, we have the child sexual abuse proposal. So those are 2 examples where encryption, in fact, governments are putting pressure on the use of encryption and trying to limit its use. So Unfortunately, that's the larger trend, I would say. In fact, negative and limiting access to encryption. It's not across the board. It might be framed as being for some specific use cases, such as private messaging or photo storage or these kinds of things. But we do see the trend, unfortunately. And I think at the heart of it, it's governments feeling that they need access to private messages, private communications, to do law enforcement, but there's obviously a tension there because it touches on freedom of expression, fundamental rights, and also, of course, the security of the individual. So, in any of these cases, I think, although the purpose can be well-intentioned, increasing security, safety for individuals, what we're seeing in the UK and the EU so far is quite misguided and dangerous, I would say. And we can talk about that a little more. I would maybe just emphasize that, again, in the UK, this online safety bill has passed and it is law, whereas in the EU, we're much earlier in the process. So the Parliament is close to establishing its position. They're a little bit more skeptical about harming encryption, whereas the Council, that position is still not defined. So there'll be a trilogue negotiation period in the coming months where we'll see where the EU eventually lands. But so far, the EU seems to be following the UK trend to some degree. And Robin and I can talk about this topic forever. So, Robin, feel free to add in on
Please
this.
go ahead, you
this
have all the
intro.
time. We're not going to cut you off.
Well,
As long as it is adding value to what we're talking about, there is really no limit to what we can discuss about this. So, yes, Robin, in any case.
And I think for your business audience, one useful thing that the Internet Society can do is perhaps uncover a little the stated motives of these kinds of legislation, and perhaps sometimes the actual motives. That may not be something that is that businesses particularly look into, but I think it affects the landscape in which they operate. So among the countries that Callum mentioned, for example, the Telecoms Act in Australia was amended to give the government powers of interception. And it was done so predominantly on the basis of counterterrorism. Well, if we look at what has been done with that law since it was enacted in Australia, the last time I looked, it had been invoked in one case of armed robbery and 2 cases of suspected domestic violence / attempted murder. So not really anything to do with terrorism at all. In India and Bangladesh, for example, the policy motivation has tended to be traceability of online content. In other words, who posted this video or who sent that message which was judged to be offensive. And elsewhere, as Callum has indicated, the EU and UK, for example, the policy has tended to be framed in terms of child safety. But as to whether that is genuinely the policy motivation, as opposed to the way it's framed, I think is very much open to question. And it's not just me. Recently, a Conservative member of the House of Lords, so in the upper house, above the government that has just passed this law, I can quote, he says, among the risks that he identifies of this act, he says, not least, the undermining of encryption sends a message to the rest of the world that the UK is willing to compromise on digital privacy and security for government access. Now, he didn't mention child safety in that law. He mentioned surveillance, essentially. So you've got a member of the government saying, this is actually really about surveillance. And I think that is really important, both for civil society, but also for business leaders, because surveillance can't happen if it's only about people's personal life. For surveillance to work, it has to be about surveilling business communications as well. And that makes me feel quite uncomfortable.
No, I was just trying to link it to how enterprises would probably interpret it, whether it is in their favor or not. But enterprises are also a part of the society. They work for financial gains, but they are also a part of society. Yeah. And I think one more thing I could bring up here, which may not be directly related, is the amount of noise which we are hearing about the AI regulatory laws. The Prime Minister, I think, a couple of days ago made some very big points. If AI is not regulated, then it's going to be really harmful for even the enterprise. And I think, again, that is not only for the enterprise, it's also for the common man. So, yes.
Yeah. Yes. There's a certain amount of existential panic, isn't there, among policymakers about AI, some of which may indeed be justified. But it's not like no one's been thinking about this. There's a huge body of research going back
Yes.
sort of decades about
And
the implications of AI. I
and,
think the
and, and
problem
then there's
is,
just so many aspects of it that need to be covered. So, I mean, that's exactly what was, what I was thinking when we read about it, that there's just too much panic happening because suddenly everything is coming to fore, and then there are deep fakes, and then there is, so much harm it can do, and so many bad things it can do. Really, I mean, I'm sure it can, but I think the excitement is a little overhyped. But
yeah,
that's okay, my opinion. Callum, you were saying something. I'm sorry I interrupted at that point.
No problem at all. It's just I think we had a slight delay, so we were talking over each other. But I was just gonna comment on what Robin was saying about scope creep. So about how the intention for these laws, whether it's fighting terrorism or disinformation or protecting children, the difference between the stated aim and the in practice application can be a little bit shocking. So there was a report from Balkan Insight, which is a journalistic organization in Europe, where they used the Freedom of Information Act to get data to get a statement from Europol. So Europol is the European law enforcement agency, and they very plainly had requested unlimited data access for future data collected under the proposal being discussed now. And just to clarify, that proposal is supposed to only be about harmful content to children, so sexual abuse kind of content. Europol was asking that they want all data. Not only that, but also, including innocent images that have nothing to do with the topic. So, clearly this is like a very troubling issue. Scope creep, law enforcement asking for more access beyond what the law actually provides for. So, again, that's maybe the difference or the gap between the stated aim and the actual aim of some of these proposals. So, yeah, just echoing that the EU also has this issue as well.
And the implications for business here can be profound. What we saw with the Online Safety Act, as it is now, was that, in fact, it didn't mention encryption at all in any meaningful way. I mean, it did at one point. It said if you're served with a warrant and before you hand over the data to law enforcement, you encrypt it so law enforcement can't read it, then you're committing an offence. Well, yes, big deal. I mean, if you do that, why are you irritating the law enforcement people in that way? So not many people are going to be rash enough to do that. But apart from that, it doesn't mention encryption once, which is weird, because what it does is it says to what the law does is it says to intermediaries, to service providers and platforms and companies, if we come to you and we ask you for this piece of data or this information that your user has created, and you can't give it to us because you let them encrypt it, then you're going to be liable. So we want access to that data. It doesn't tell them how, but how are they going to respond? They're going to say, oh, well, we'd better not let them encrypt it in the first place then. So without mentioning encryption once, it is actually aimed at discouraging or even preventing service providers and companies from providing end-to-end encrypted communication. And to link that back to our IoT example, pretty much every IoT deployment has the object and the thing that you control the object with, usually your mobile phone. And in between those two things, there'll be something in the cloud that, for example, passes the message from, in my case, the app on my iPad that will unlock my car, or that sends me something from the CCTV camera at the door to say there is someone ringing the bell, and then you send a control message back to say, okay, unlock the door. Well, if that's not end-to-end encrypted, then those control messages can be forged, tampered with, suppressed. And so again, putting this sort of obligation on the intermediary to be able to intercept that traffic actually opens it up to malicious actors to do the same, and thereby, as I sort of stated in the opening remarks about IoT, actually to threaten your physical safety and your home and your family and your children. So this is not just a cozy thing about, oh, well, my data or my messages were encrypted. This is about physical safety as well.
Absolutely. And the more this kind of devices are, being used in the day-to-day purposes, the higher the risk becomes.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
as you said, your home, your car, your home, your work, everything is on,
Yeah.
on display, so to speak. Anybody can have
Sure.
access to it. Just one hacker can get all of the data. And yes, it
Well,
is.
and
So it
also,
is insecurity at all levels.
yeah, and since Callum rightly mentioned that the whole framing of this often as a child safety issue, one of the most disturbing cases that I saw was a company that produced cuddly toys as connected objects. So the idea was, so imagine I go on a business trip, I can phone a web service and I can leave a message for my child. And when the child presses the paw of the bear, it downloads the message and plays it. Well, this is fantastic. You say your good night message and the kid's in bed with the little toy and they press the paw and daddy's message comes through. How sweet. But as I say, that all goes through something in the cloud. And in this instance, that thing in the cloud was not secured. So the first thing that attackers did was they got the credit card details of the subscribers to that service. All the caring mummies and daddies lost their credit card details. The second thing was that they got access to the messages. And what they actually did with them was they held them ransom. They said, look, if you want the messages back, you have to pay us. But think what they could have done. That insecure connected object was actually a route into a child's bedroom. And that's profoundly disturbing. But you can take two approaches to that. You can either say, well, the best thing to do in that situation is to make sure that that link is secure, or you can take the approach that the UK and EU legislation is taking and say, no, we want you to make that link insecure so that it can be intercepted. And that just, to me, is crazy.
Yeah, I think...
Now that you say it, sounds really, really scary.
It is scary.
Yes.
It's really scary. When Robin mentions this pressure, right, put on the providers to provide access, right, besides the option of just completely removing encryption entirely from their services, we see kind of two other main talking points that we hear policymakers. So it's one would be the installation of encryption backdoors, and one would be client-side scanning. So I think in Europe, in the EU and the UK, and I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, the conversation was very much around these backdoors, right? That the government needs access, they need their own key. There was a lot of pressure from experts, from technologists, from the Internet Society, from our partners about how this creates weaknesses, and that's a access point for criminals or third parties, right? So in Europe, I think the trend we're seeing, thankfully, is that the encryption backdoors option is becoming less and less viable for policymakers. Not dead, and in many parts of the world, it's still a very active discussion. But I think in Europe and the UK, we're seeing more and more of this move to the discussion about client-side scanning, right? So here, there are completely separate issues that we worry about, but it's still related to security. It's still about the attack surface being large. It's still about, of course, privacy. So the metaphor we often use is, if an encryption backdoor, if breaking encryption is like someone opening your letter at the post office, then client-side scanning is like somebody reading your letter over your shoulder as you write it. So the end result is kind of the same. So these are the trends we're seeing, and I think for companies, this does impact their business, right? So if you're one of the companies that would fall within the scope of either the UK Online Safety Bill or the European Child Sexual Abuse Proposal, you need to take action, right? So that would be implementing client-side scanning or the encryption backdoor or whatever kind of solution is fallen upon in the end. But that's probably pretty expensive to implement those things. And, even in the EU, their parliamentary impact assessment, so the government's own analysis, they found that EU businesses would be unlikely to make innovations with end-to-end encryption. Because this would be much more viable to be done in other countries. So again, the innovation aspect, how businesses can use encryption, it's all being pressurized, right? And that will make businesses very wary about putting investments into new technologies, combining encryption in new, novel ways. As a business, you might think twice if you're in a jurisdiction that has these laws, right? So I think for businesses, it really is something to consider. In the case of the EU and the UK, businesses that are definitely under the scope of these bills, WhatsApp, Signal, private messaging companies, they've all said they will leave the markets. So they will leave the UK market if now that this law is passed, when it's implemented, they will leave. So I think for businesses, it's really even if you're not exactly in this industry, it's something you should be aware of, and it's something you should be watching, because it could really hit your bottom line, which I think is what we saw in Australia, actually, because as Robin mentioned, there was this telecoms act, TOLA is the nickname, TOLA, and we worked with economists, and one business estimated that they lost 1 billion Australian dollars in investment because investors didn't want to invest in a company based in a country where encryption is so limited or could be limited. So this is also about perceptions and the business environment and how open it is for investment and innovation. So yeah, just a few messages maybe would be interesting to your listeners about what we're seeing, and not only us, but even the European Parliament. They're seeing these same issues.
So one very hands-on kind of a question. What are the challenges that you think business leaders face while encrypting their sensitive data? Part of it, which you already answered in your last input that we spoke. What are the best strategies you think that they can implement to overcome these challenges? So when I'm saying encryption of data, I'm essentially talking about data pertaining to their business processes, so operations data. And Robin would know I'm talking about. They have these massive databases of clients' data, their operations processes, and whatever stuff like that. They need to encrypt that, of course. And the government would like to get their hands on it, but do they really need it? Well, it's up in the air. So what do you think are the best ways of dealing with that, encrypting it, and what are the challenges? How should they do it? How do they go about doing it?
Yeah, thanks, Kanika. I think, well, step one is to be really clear about the structures here. Have a clear taxonomy in your business head about what it is that you're protecting. Most of what we've talked about so far in this discussion has been so-called data in motion. In other words, communicating, whether it's between devices or people. But the situation you describe is more accurately usually referred to as data at rest. In other words, it's the data when it's sitting there, it's in your hands, you need to analyze it from time to time, or it's transactional databases, but it's at rest, it's not communicated. And this raises a few challenges, and it always has, because clearly the whole point of encrypting data is you can't then understand it, which makes it really hard to conduct transactions on it. It all becomes a little bit random. There is potentially a technical development that will that helps there, but I'll come to that in a second. So the traditional enterprise posture for data at rest starts by depending on the things that I mentioned earlier. So strong authentication, authorization, which is basically, now that I know who you are, what are you allowed to do? And then access control, which is checking that I only do the things that I'm allowed to do and not other things, and that I only access the resources that I'm entitled to access and not others. So those are standard enterprise IT security disciplines. But obviously the goal there is to protect access to the data in question. Now, managing data at rest, if it's encrypted, the primary difficulties, challenges there are usually to do with key management. And this used to be a lot harder than it is now. In the olden days of symmetric encryption, you had to make sure that you changed your keys periodically, and changing the keys at this layer required you to change the keys that they're encrypted under, and so on. So there was a whole hierarchy of changes that had to ripple through and be managed over time, and that was tough. With the advent of public key encryption, that has become a lot easier, because you no longer have the logistical challenge of securely distributing master keys. Anyone in the banking industry will remember a time when actually, if you thought the keys in your ATMs, your automated teller machines were compromised, a lot of your junior staff would jump into their company cars with 2 pieces of paper and actually physically go and replace the keys. So public key encryption gets around that. It imposes some other disciplines, but it gets around that. Now, I mentioned a potential innovation in the area of data at rest and computing with encrypted data. And this is a discipline called homomorphic encryption. This is a way of encrypting data so that you can still operate on it and get an encrypted result back for your database query, which sounds like black magic. I mean, it sounds crazy, but mathematically it's possible. It has a number of limitations, but actually the main driver for it in the commercial context is that it makes it possible for you to lodge your data with a third party, in other words, in most cases, a cloud service, but to leave it with them in encrypted form and still make queries against it. Now, as things stand at the moment, the queries have to be pretty simple. They have to be, for example, does this field in the database match this value? It can do matching, it can do addition, it can do multiplication. It can't do much else. It certainly can't do things like semantic interpretation of values. So it's a technology with some constraints, but it does perform a limited set of functions without ever decrypting the data. So it's an interesting thing to keep an eye on. Oh, the other thing is it's really computationally intensive. So don't think you're going to be running these queries on your phone. It'll probably melt in your pocket if you try. It's slow, it's computationally intensive, but for some particular applications, it may be a technology to watch.
Callum, anything to add to that?
No, I would say, Robin's talking about the importance of businesses staying on top of these trends in encryption. So that's the question: what's coming in the future? What do we need to be aware of? How do we prepare for that, adjust for that, be on top of things in advance? So I definitely echo that. I think that's a really important approach. I would just mention, the Global Encryption Coalition, which we're founding members of. We offer support to businesses that want to, deploy strong encryption on their services and on their platforms. So that's a community, as I said, 250 organizations, all very happy, to help and offer support. So that's maybe a resource for businesses looking for that support. And I would say for businesses, also, to speak up about new encryption laws, rather it's that more kind of proactive aspect. So, that encryption is important and, providing evidence of this. But also when there are laws that are threatening encryption, to speak out about how that really would impact their business. I think policymakers are very interested in hearing, especially from small and medium enterprises, from startups. They're very concerned that these new laws could harm, innovation in their countries. So that's a stakeholder, small businesses, that the government really wants to hear from. So your audience, they have a voice, a really important voice. And so if they do care about these issues, I would say they should speak out on it. But I think otherwise, just echoing what Robin already shared.
So we should get the message out there. Our audiences who are in the enterprise industry globally do have a voice, and they should speak up about it.
Definitely. Yeah.
Right. And with that, I think I will have to thank both of you for your time. And of course, the very interesting conversation that we had. And I hope to speak with you again at some point in time. There's something more interesting coming up. Let's look forward to it. Thank you so much, Callum and Robin, for giving us your time today. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kanika. It's been a pleasure. It's been a delight.
Thank you so much for being with us. Please do follow us on social media for regular updates and new content.